Each and every single human being needs to eat to stay alive. Some of us love to eat food, okay? Now, what is the real reason that we need to eat? Why? So to understand this, I want you to look at Ronaldo. So Ronaldo is a human being just like any of us. And he's made up of billions of cells, right? Cells are the smallest units of life, the smallest living thing that we are made of. Now, let's go one step further. What are cells made of? So cells are made up of these four components: lipids, proteins, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids, right? So in fact, the smallest thing that we're made up is made up of these things. And when we eat food, we will get in all of these components. And when we get in all of these components, our cells can be healthy because they will now have all the little machinery or parts that they need, all the materials that they need to be healthy and make new cells, right? So that's the real purpose. Now, each of these components have a different role. So, for example, proteins, like we talked about in the last video, help us do many little tasks in our cells. Lipids can help us store some energy and they help make up the cell membrane. Now, carbohydrates is the purpose of this video. And what exactly is the purpose of carbohydrates? So, carbohydrates, when you think of this word, you think, oh man, shouldn't eat too much of that because it'll make me fat, right? That's technically true because the real purpose of carbohydrate is energy. And if we eat more energy than we need, and we don't burn as much energy as we just ate, it will build up and get stored as fat. So carbohydrates can get converted into fats. So you need to understand that. So if you eat too much carbohydrates and don't do enough exercise to burn off that carbohydrates, it'll get stored as fat, okay? So the fat is the real reason we don't like carbohydrates. Now, interestingly, when you do exercise, it takes about 20 minutes for you to burn all of your carbohydrates. After that, you're going to start burning lipids and then proteins, okay? So that's why if you do a long run, why you lose weight is because after 20 minutes, you'll start burning fats, and that's why you will look good after a while of doing it, okay? So that's the key thing about that you need to know about carbohydrates. It is just a form of energy that our cells need to survive. So here we have Hulk, okay? We know Hulk's a big guy, okay? And he loves to eat, because otherwise, how would he be this massive? So here we have two foods, okay? I'm going to use this to explain carbohydrates. So here we have a croissant, okay? A French bread, okay? And we got a nice piece of steak. Now, all foods, you need to understand this, all foods are made up of these four components, okay? Because if you think about it, this meat is just a piece of muscle from an animal, right? So this piece of muscle is made up of cells, and we know that all cells are made up of these four components, okay? So you need to understand when you think, oh, bread is carbohydrates, the reason why we call bread carbohydrates is because it is mainly made up of carbohydrates. It's also made up of protein and lipids and nucleic acids, but its main component is carbohydrates. Meat, on the other hand, its minor component is carbohydrates. So it's mainly made up of protein as opposed to carbohydrates, but it has still got some carbohydrates. Now, so when you stop eating bread, it doesn't mean you're not eating carbohydrates anymore. It just means now you're only eating meat, so you're getting less carbohydrates in. So here we have Hulk, okay, and we're gonna basically give him, here's his intestines, here's his organs, okay. You can see his esophagus, his stomach, his intestines, right? So he's gonna eat this carbohydrate. Now, before he eats this, I want you to understand what carbohydrates really is, okay? So I told you it's one of the components of a cell. Now, carbohydrates is basically this, okay? If we zoom into this croissant, we will see many of these molecules, okay? They look all very similar. Do you notice? They all have this kind of hexagon or whatever kind of shape, pentagon. They all have these unique kind of shape like this. Now, they are not free floating like this. If they are free floating like this, like they're alone by themselves, then we call it a monosaccharide. Okay, so for example, let's ignore, these are all different versions of carbohydrates. So we're just going to focus on the one up there. Okay, so ignore these for now. I'm going to look at this one. So let's say we take one of these molecules. It's called a monosaccharide. Mono means single, and saccharide means sugar. So it's a single sugar. Now, in reality, in your bread, it is not a single form like this. Normally, they are connected to each other. So for example, if we have two of these connected to each other, it's called a disaccharide, okay? A disaccharide. If we have many connected to each other, so we form a whole chain of them, which is the reality, like inside bread, you have a whole chain of them. They're all stored together, okay? This is called a polysaccharide. Remember, di means two, and poly means a chain, a long chain. Okay, so that is the meaning of these three words. Monosaccharides, disaccharides, polysaccharides, okay? The only difference between them is the length of the chain. Now, I gave you one example, okay? There are many different types of monosaccharides. So this is one example of a monosaccharide, but this is another example of a monosaccharide, okay? So monosaccharide is just a category for sugars that are alone, okay? Hope you understand that now. So now let's get back to Hulk, okay? He takes in this croissant, so he's eating it, okay? And once he eats it, it's gonna go down his esophagus into its stomach, okay? And remember I said that inside here we have polysaccharides, okay? They're all connected to each other. Now when he's eating it, it's coming down here and his stomach is gonna break down this croissant. And as it breaks it down, it's gonna break down this polysaccharide into monosaccharide. So it's going to break it down completely like this in the stomach. Why does it do that? The reason is because as a polysaccharide, it is too big. It's too big to be absorbed. So once it's in the stomach, a polysaccharide can't be absorbed into your bloodstream. It's too big. So when your stomach will break it down into monosaccharides, and monosaccharides are small enough to be taken up into your bloodstream, okay? So that's important. So now let's go to the bloodstream. So we just absorbed now these monosaccharides, okay, because they're small enough. So here we have two examples, okay. Notice their structure. You don't need to focus. I think for the IB, you need to know how to draw a glucose. So this is a glucose. This is an example of a monosaccharide, right? A monosaccharide because it's alone. But look at the structure. We notice it has 6 sides, right? 6 sides. And it's got carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. But notice the difference between these two versions of glucose. Notice the difference between the versions. One is called an alpha glucose and one is called a beta glucose. What is the difference? Spot the difference. The difference lies here. In a beta glucose, we have the hydrogen molecule below, B for below. Whereas in the alpha glucose, we have the hydrogen A for above. Okay, it's got above. So that's a good way you can remember the difference between alpha glucose and beta glucose. These two are considered to be isomers. Isomers is a name that basically means they are the same thing. They're made up of the same units, but they're slightly differently arranged. So both of these, if you count up all the carbons and you count up the oxygens and you count up the hydrogens, you'll notice they're the exact same in both of these molecules. So an isomer is when you do this and you count them up and they're the exact same, but they look different. That's an isomer. Okay, so going back to this. So he ate his food, he broke down this polysaccharide into monosaccharides, and he absorbs these monosaccharides. Right now, we're only putting the glucoses. Obviously, he can absorb all these other ones as well, okay? But we're only focusing now on glucose. So he absorbs these monosaccharides into the blood, and now we know the blood pretty much serves as a road, a transport road for all the little molecules that was absorbed. So now these are moving around, okay, in the blood, and eventually they're going to get transported to a cell, a target cell, right? A cell that needs them to use them. So these can go into these cells. So we have two examples here, a liver cell and a muscle cell. Don't worry about me naming these, just pretend they're any cell, okay? So let's say we consider a muscle cell or any cell, okay? It doesn't matter. I'm just trying to use an example. And this glucose molecule was now taken up into this cell. One purpose of this glucose molecule is to be broken down for energy. That's one thing, right? I said glucose is important for energy. So this is a monosaccharide, remember? And we know, or later on you will learn, if you haven't learned yet, you'll learn later on about something called cell respiration. Cell respiration is a method used by cells to break down glucose to form something called ATP, or energy. And now this energy can allow a cell to do many things and survive, okay? So that's one thing that can happen when glucose gets taken up by a cell. What's another thing that can happen? So another thing that can happen is this. Say it takes up some glucose. So by the way, here we have the alpha isomer of glucose, okay, because the H is above. And so say it takes them up. What else can it do besides break it down? It can put them together. So remember, when he eats this food, he breaks them down from a polysaccharide to a monosaccharide, okay? Because otherwise he can't absorb it. But once he absorbs this monosaccharides, he can put them back together again into a polysaccharide, or a disaccharide, whatever. Because maybe he doesn't need that glucose right away for energy. Maybe he has enough energy, but he just wants to store it for later when he needs it. So, how do we put it together? So let me show you. We're going to use the box of love to explain this. We're going to put it together through something called a condensation reaction, and this will make sense right now. So you notice these two, they are right next to each other, right? And you need to understand something. Scientists label these carbons according to numbers. So let's look at this one. They start at this carbon here, and they call this one 1. Okay, they called carbon 1. And then they go they go clockwise. So they're going to go here. So this will be carbon 2. This will be carbon 3. This will be carbon 4, 5, and 6. So the same here. We start with this one on the right. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Let me show this, make this clear. So we notice this will be carbon 4 of one glucose molecule, and this will be carbon 1 of another. And they will interact with each other. The carbon here and the carbon here and the carbon here. Okay, so let me show you. Specifically, the carbons are not going to interact with each other. Rather, these OH groups, this oxygen-hydrogen groups. What's going to happen is the oxygen, you notice the oxygen is having 2 bonds. One to carbon and one to hydrogen. This one as well. This oxygen has 1 bond to carbon and 1 bond to hydrogen. Now, what's going to happen is this OH group is going to let go of this carbon. Okay, and then this H group is going to let go of this hydrogen. And you notice that means 2 H's and 1 O had let go. And that we know 2 H and 1 O form water, H2O. Okay, so let me show you here. Okay, these are going to combine together to form water. And that's why it's called condensation, because condensation means water, to form water, right? When you boil the kettle, some condensation is going to form. Some water molecules are going to become gas. That's the same here. Water leaves through condensation. Now, when they left, what does that mean? That means carbon is missing a bond, because normally it likes to have 4 bonds. 1 to hydrogen here, 1 to this carbon, 1 to this carbon, 1 to this oxygen. But now that this group had left, it's missing a bond. It now only has 3 bonds, so it really wants to form another bond. Same here. This hydrogen left. This oxygen normally loves to make 2 bonds. 1 to carbon, 1 to hydrogen, but now it's missing a bond. So coincidentally, this oxygen is missing a bond and this carbon is missing a bond. So what's going to happen is this oxygen will now bind with this carbon, and now they're both happy. So let me show you. And this bond will be called a glycosidic bond. Glycosidic bond, okay? Let me show you here. So here's the molecule. So when they combine together, we notice this oxygen now bound with that carbon, okay? That is the glycosidic bond. You need to know how this works. You need to know how to both draw individual glucoses like this and how to draw them when they've bounded together. Now, when they bind together like this, and this forms what? This forms from a monosaccharide to a disaccharide. When 2 alpha glucoses or 2 glucose molecules binds together, it forms maltose. Maltose, okay? This is a disaccharide. Notice all these names I'm giving you, like glucose, maltose, they all end in ose. Ose, when you see a word that ends in ose, you know it's a carbohydrate. It's a type of carbohydrate, okay? Bear that in mind. Okay, that's good for this. So now you know how two glucoses come together. Now, if this continues to happen, because you're not only going to put two of them together, you're going to form a whole chain. You're going to keep putting them together until you have them all stored if you don't need them. So if this keeps happening, you'll form a long chain like this, okay? I simplified these here for you, okay? Because otherwise it's going to look complicated. Now, when you form a whole chain of them, it's called glycogen. Remember, right here we put together two glucoses, it's called maltose. When you put a whole chain together, so you form a polysaccharide, it's called glycogen, okay? So Hulk is going to store all this glucose that he ate, if he doesn't need it yet, in his cells as glycogen. And later, when he really needs it, for example, when he's going to go smash something, he can break down this glycogen again into glucose, right? And then glucose can be used for energy, okay? So it's just about efficiency. Sometimes you need it, sometimes you don't. When you need it, you break it down for energy. When you don't need it, you store it, okay? Now, cool, that makes sense so far. There's one last thing we can do. So remember how I said there are different types of carbohydrates. So we just talked about one type, which is glucose, okay? Now, for example, let's say Hulk is drinking some milk, okay? What happens is milk has a special ingredient in it. Milk is a type of carbohydrate, right? Milk counts as carbohydrates. What's interesting in milk is there's a structure that looks like this, okay? And this structure is called lactose. So you know some people are lactose intolerant, okay? What does that mean? I'll tell you just now what that means. But once again, pay attention, there's an os. This means it's a carbohydrate. So when he drinks this lactose, he absorbs it through his intestines and it goes into his blood, right? Now, lactose is something that you can, is in milk, right? And you can break it down just like this to use for energy. Okay, you can use it for, because you can go and break this glucose down and this one down by cell respiration. Now, some people cannot break it down because you need an enzyme. Remember, an enzyme is a protein that helps break down things, helps make reactions happen. So some people are incapable of breaking down lactose like this. And these people are called lactose intolerant. Now, anyways, if you can break them down, you will break them down into two molecules. One is called glucose and one is called galactose. So, again, to clarify, lactose is a disaccharide because it's made up of two monosaccharides. So here's two more examples. So we know glucose already is a monosaccharide. Another example is galactose. It's also a monosaccharide. Now, notice how I didn't give you the real structure of galactose. This is because you don't need to know it for the IB, okay? But glucose you do. I showed you the real structure for glucose because you need to know how to draw it. But galactose, you only need to know that when galactose, the monosaccharide, combines with glucose, it will form lactose, okay? And lactose is found in milk. So, for example, when a cow drinks from the mum, it's going to get lactose and it can break it down and use it for energy, okay? So it's a form of food, sort of. Okay, cool. Let's move on now. So that's all you need to know for humans, okay? That's all you need to know for animals. Let's talk about carbohydrates in terms of plants. So we know plants are different. They don't have a mouth like Hulk. They can't ingest food and break it down. So rather, they make their food, right? So let's go here. Using sunlight, this is a plant cell because it's got a chloroplast, right? So understand that. The other cells I used only had mitochondria. They didn't have chloroplast. Now, this plant cell can use the chloroplast with sunlight to make all of these monosaccharides, okay? So glucose and another one called fructose. So I didn't mention fructose in humans and animals because animals don't make fructose, okay? Like it's not an important molecule in animals, okay? Fructose, for you to know, fructose is the molecule, and again, look, it ends in ose, once again, pay attention to that. Fructose is a little monosaccharide that makes fruits on plants sweet, okay? So it's a sweetening agent. So the reason why the fruit you eat or the fruit that the animals eat from plants are sweet is because of fructose. And this is important because if it wasn't sweet, then animals won't eat it. And if animals don't eat it, then the seeds inside the fruits will not get dispersed and the plants can't grow in many places, right? So it's efficient for that. And we know what glucose is for. The plant can use it to break it down through cell respiration for energy, right? Just like humans. Now, you need to know that these two these two monosaccharides, glucose and fructose, can combine together. And when they combine together like this is now called sucrose. And again, it ends in ose. Okay, sucrose is basically something a plant can use. Again, it's not in humans. It's something a plant can use to help its cells survive. Okay, so it's also useful for energy and some other processes inside plant cells. You don't need to know that much detail about it. You just need to know cells, plant cells can use it for survival and energy. Okay, so not bad so far. But we need to get to one other part. So remember in humans how after you absorb the glucose, you can put it together and store it in case for a time when you will need it. Because if you don't need it right now, you can store it as glycogen, right, for energy for later use. Plants can do the same thing. So let me show you. So plants can put together these glucoses into a long chain. And this, instead of being called glycogen, like it was called in humans, it is called starch. Starch, right? Now you can see here's the long chain. And this chain of glucose will form into this helix shape. Okay, so let me show you. It forms into the helix-like structure. Helix, okay? For some reason. You don't need to know the reason right now, but there's some small bonding and some interactions that happen that you don't need to care about. You just need to know that when plants put together all their glucoses, it's called starch, not glycogen like in humans. Now, bear in mind, you can see here, that this glucose interacts with the adjacent ones, okay? And when it forms this helix-like structure, it's called amylose. Amylose. So starch, there's different types of starch. Amylose, it's called amylose when it forms this helix-like structure, okay? Continuous helix structure. And again, to emphasize, remember before how we showed that the bonding always happens between carbon 1, right, of the one molecule, and carbon 4 of the other molecule. So this is still the same, okay? So that's why it's called a 1,4 glycosidic bond. Oh yeah, wait, I think I'm missing something. Oh, so remember the glycosidic bond, yeah? I wasn't missing anything. I thought I was. Okay, so it's called a 1,4 glycosidic bond because it's between the... Oh, I'm doing this wrong. Between the first carbon... I'm moving this wrong. Between the first carbon and the fourth carbon of two adjacent glucose molecules. So it's called a 1,4 glycosidic bond because it's a glycosidic bond. Okay, so don't think that this is confusing. It just means... It's just trying to show you how the bonding happens between the 1 and the 4... one carbon and the fourth carbon of two adjacent molecules. Okay, so this is amylose. Okay, there's one other one you need to know. Okay, so it's also called a starch because it's a chain of glucose molecules in plants. But this one is complicated looking. Let me show you here the real one. I mean, with a simplified image. It's basically when you have an amylose, with a branch off of it. Okay, this is called Amylopectin. Okay, because it's got an amylose, but it's also got this branch off of it. So it's not very simple like an amylose, it's also got branching. So my question is, and what you need to know, is what causes this branching? So remember before, in amylose, all these glucoses are linked together with 1,4 glycosidic bonds. Now this branch happens when something gets changed. So look at this glucose molecule. We know this is the first one, this is the second carbon, third carbon, fourth carbon, fifth carbon, and this is the sixth carbon. Notice here, this branch happens because there's an interaction or a glycosidic bond between the sixth carbon and the first carbon instead of the normal 4 to 1 or 1 to 4, right? So this 1 to 6 glycosidic bond causes this branching out. So you can see now it's normal again here, like 1 to 4, but the reason why it branches is because of this 1 to 6 instead of 1 to 4 glycosidic bond. And when this happens, so when you see this kind of structure, it's called amylopectin. Both amylose and amylopectin are examples of starch, okay? And starch is how glucose is stored in plants. Glycogen is how glucose is stored in animals, right? We saw that before. So lastly, we're finally here. Cellulose. So we know that starch is one way in which glucose can be stored. there's another way in which glucose can be stored, and this is called cellulose. Only this glucose is not alpha glucoses. Remember, I showed you two types of glucoses you got to know. Beta and alpha. We talked so far only about alpha. When beta glucoses bind together, it forms cellulose. Okay? When alpha glucoses bind together in plants, it forms starch. So let's go. So here we have cellulose, and I'll talk to you why I'm putting poops here. Okay? So here I'll show you. So you can see there's a chain, and this one is green because it's beta glucoses. And they also bind together by 1,4 linkage, okay? So it's also the same. It's also 1,4 glycosidic bonds. The only difference is now it's beta glucoses instead of alpha glucoses. Now, after these are put together, they don't form a helix structure like we just talked about in starch. They form a sheet, a flat layer. And all of these flat layers will have little bondings in between them called hydrogen bonds. Like here, like I showed you here. You don't need to understand this, okay? You just need to know that they exist. And these hydrogen bonds help to keep these layers together, and they keep them strong. And the reason why this structure forms is for structural purpose. Cellulose is a strength thing, and it basically, after it gets formed, it gets put into the membrane of the plant cell to keep it strong. That's why plant cells are much stronger than human cells. Okay, because the cellulose is a structural thing, and it gets put into the membrane of the plant cell to keep it strong. Okay, so that's one key thing you need to know, that when alpha glucoses get put together, it's starch. When beta glucoses get put together, it is cellulose. And why did I put poop here? Because when humans now decide to eat this plant, it's gonna get both starch and cellulose, right? We're gonna have both starch and cellulose in our stomachs now, right? So when Hulk eats it, he's gonna get both starch and cellulose inside his blood. Inside his stomach. Now, we have an enzyme that can break down starch. Okay, we have an enzyme that can break down starch into the monosaccharides, but we don't have an enzyme that can break down cellulose. So what's gonna happen is all the starch will be broken down until they're monosaccharides, and we can put it back into our blood. But the cellulose, because it is made up of beta glucoses, that's different. So we need a different enzyme for that. And humans, we don't have that enzyme. So when we eat cellulose, we can't break these bonds. And so what's going to happen is we're going to poop it out. Okay? So we are unable to actually get in cellulose from plants. That will get pooped out, whereas starch will actually be absorbed and used. So that's why cows are different. Cows actually have this enzyme, and so when they eat plants, they get the full benefit out of the plant because they can use both the cellulose and the starch, whereas humans can only get the starch. So I hope, here's a little summary. So all the monosaccharides you need to know, what happens when you put them together in different orders. And yeah, I hope this made as much sense as possible, and that it will help you with this chapter.